Okay, so good morning. Ricardo asked me to organize this presentation for you a little bit about my experience working and living here in Canada, working with indigenous populations here. I'm teaching topics related to indigenous cultures here in Canada, a little bit about indigenous rights, the importance of the treaties, and also in some situations, some comparisons with the work that I have also conducted doing my PhD in Brazil. Right? In Brazil, I had a chance to work with an indigenous population named Caiabi. They are located in the southeast part of the Brazilian Amazon. My main focus of research with the Caiabi was their relationships with the land, the relationship with traditional territories. In many situations, they were very concerned, right? That I'm sure that that's probably something very common there in Colombia to this kind of reality that many indigenous peoples are facing in the world today. Many people invading their territories, in some ways illegal invasions, in some cases people really trying to take possession of their traditional territories with different forms of the environment exploitation without having their proper permission, the permission of the government. So it was part of my research to better understand and give some directions to this environmental conflict that was happening and still happening in their land, in their communities. When I came to Canada, I came also with the purpose to work with two communities north of Thunder Bay. These two communities, they had two situations in common because in around 1930s, their traditional lands were flooded to create two hydroelectric stations. That's something very common in Brazil too, I suppose also very common in Colombia. But this happened in 1930, 1930s, 19, one in 1929, the other one 1935. They were not consulted. It was only more recently that they were able to go to the courts to require some kind of reparation, some kind of compensation. So I have also been working closely with them in this court battles. Right? So that also ended up becoming one of my recent branches in using anthropology, this subfield that we refer to as juridical anthropology, to understand the legislations of the countries, the indigenous rights, to discuss a little bit about the history of indigenous occupations and how their specific way to deal with the land, to deal with the territory, is normally not so well understood by the countries, by the courts, by the governments. And in one way, I think anthropologists, or the knowledge that we may acquire by learning anthropology, can be helpful in terms of translating the patterns of using the land from one culture to another. So that's one way that I think I can summarize the kind of research that I'm doing. So the way that I prepared this presentation here, and Ricardo also asked you to read a few chapters from one of the books that I normally use in my classes. It's a well organized, a well summarized version of some important policies that basically were very important to support all what was going to come in terms of building relationships between initially the British Crown and later on the Canadian federal government in terms of regulating these relationships between the Canadian state and the indigenous groups that live here in Canada. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen here with you. Let's see if I can touch this. Okay, let me open this in a large screen. So can you all see that?
Yes, yes, we got it.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, that's the first policy that I like to call your attention here. It's called the Royal Proclamation. So it's not a lot. You can see it's basically a little bit more than 2 pages that were written in very small letters at the time that the King George III was the King of England. So this document was issued in 1763, and it was considered a very important document to regulate everything that was going after that in terms of recognizing indigenous rights in Canada. The Royal Proclamation was a document that came right after this very important war that happened between England and France to see who was going to be more in control of the lands in this area here that later would become Canada. As you probably know, the British ended up winning this war. This war became known as the 7 Years' War. So as soon as the Great Britain, they won this war, they needed to find some way to deal with the lands that were being used by the indigenous nations here in Canada. So of course, and most of this proclamation also applies to the territory that later on became United States, because at this point, 1763, there was no Canada, there was no United States, but there were indigenous groups living in many of these areas. So they needed to find a place to live. All right. So this document was considered by many experts in indigenous law as like the indigenous Magna Carta, right? Or the foundational document to define indigenous rights in North America, because the proclamation defined certain territories that were supposed to be reserved with indigenous nations to live, and they're not supposed to be disturbed in any circumstance unless the crown would see any kind of specific purpose for those lands to be used or to be sold in any direction. Right, so that's what's being stated here in the proclamation, that some parts are going to be reserved to the indigenous groups, and then they could only be extinguished. These rights could only be extinguished for particular reasons that the crown would consider relevant. So let me just move here to the next one. So this is the design of how North America was looking like around that time in 1763. Right? If you could look here in this area here, that's kind of light brown, these are considered the indigenous territories that were demarcated, or at least reserved by the British Crown for the indigenous nations to live. So all that there was at that time that was somehow associated with the origins of United States are these 13 colonies here. Even Florida was still not even associated at the 13 colonies that later on would be expanded and would become part of United States. So the Royal Proclamation also encompasses part of the United States. So I'm just mentioning this document because it's very important. That's one way, and I think probably an important way, how I learned about the history of indigenous rights here in Canada, the history of colonization. And you're going to see in many ways, it's very different from the history of colonization in South America and even in the United States, because these processes of colonization were normally considered more violent, in that sense that indigenous nations were normally dispossessed of their territories. They were kidnapped, they were enslaved, right? They were in many cases they were terminated, they were executed by the colonizers, because they didn't see, they normally would see the indigenous cultures as an obstacle for them to occupy and take the resources from this country. So in Canada, one thing for you to know right from the start is that the process was not, at least initially, was not so violent in that sense, with too many massacres as we normally see in the history of this colonization in South America and even in the United States. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't effective in destroying indigenous cultures. It was indeed very effective, but in a different way. Right? Instead of just eliminating them, the general project from the British Crown was to convert them, to assimilate them, right? To integrate them as quickly as possible through a series of policies that were directed to eliminate indigenous cultures in Canada without necessarily having to kill them. Basically, it was more like a cultural genocide in that sense than an actual genocide of having, when they are actually killing or doing or eliminating these populations. So that's one way to start to look at the indigenous history in Canada. The Royal Proclamation is a very important document. In the end, I'm also going to talk about another very important meeting, right? That is also associated with the Royal Proclamation that happened in 1764, just 1 year after the proclamation. That is referred by the indigenous nations as the Treaty of Niagara. Niagara is, if you're not familiar, it's a small town located not that far from Toronto and the border between Canada and United States. They're very famous for the Niagara Falls, very big waterfalls. So in that location, many indigenous leaders, they met in 1764 to ratify, to confirm the terms of the proclamation, essentially assuming that the two nations would recognize each other. The two nations, considering the indigenous nations and the European nations, they would recognize each other as separate, as autonomous, as independent, and that they would try to live their lives together but separate, kind of respecting each other's way to deal with the land. So these were the initial promises that the colonizers they tend to honor. That's something that's also widely discussed in the history of colonization in Canada, because at this point in the history, you can imagine, there were not too many European settlers already in North America. There was no plan yet to establish a colonization of this area. They had their own problems already in Europe, trying to protect their own territories already in Europe. So they already have very important concerns that they will not be even losing the wars that were happening in Europe at that time. So what to do with North America at that time was not their primary concern. So they wanted to find something here in North America, at least, to provide some kind of peace, to stabilize the situation, that later on they'll try to deal with that. Right? But they really had these initial promises when they recognized the indigenous nations as equals. Right? There was not this idea to colonize, to destroy them, to take resources, but this idea that, okay, we recognize your rights, so these territories are going to be used by your own cultures. You have the right to live there, to practice your traditional ways of living. You're not supposed to be bothered by any other European settlers, and that's how it all started. Right. So, and then there are even some quotes, and I found this really very emblematic quote that's also from the readings that you are asked to accomplish. Right. That's coming from there. So the Royal Proclamation provided this official recognition of aboriginal rights, and that's this quote here from George Washington, right? That is considered one of the founding fathers of the North American democracy, right? And he was saying that the Royal Proclamation is a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. I think it summarizes really well the purposes behind what the Europeans were thinking from the proclamation. Right? Basically, something that's supposed to be temporary. We want to make sure that they're going to be more quiet, that they're not going to be at war, because you cannot manage two difficult situations, one in North America and another one in Europe. So let's find an expedient to quiet their minds and recognize this territory for them to live in their traditional ways, at least to stop different kinds of pressure in their lands. And in 1839, the Great Britain legally declared Amerindian lands to be crown lands. So that, again, this is considered like a unilateral decision coming only from the side of the British Crown, saying that all the lands that are part of the proclamation automatically would be transferred and transformed into crown lands without any kind of consultation, right? Any kind of participation from the indigenous leaders. At this time, you can see, right, something already 50, 60 years after the proclamation, that the British settlers were already starting to plan more organized measures to take possession of the indigenous territories in North America. So at this point, we start to hear certain terms that would try to put the indigenous cultures in a position of inferiority when compared to the European settlers. Previously, I think we can say that they were in a position of equality, that they were recognized in their same terms. But terms like wardship, wordship, I don't know how you say that in Spanish. In Portuguese, you say tutela, which means that it's a group of individuals or certain individuals that are assumed not to be capable to take care of themselves, normally children, right? Individuals who have some kind of condition that they cannot make proper decisions for themselves. So they are expected to, that someone is nominated as a ward. So the people that are going to be taking control of their decisions are making decisions for them because they cannot know what's best for them. So at this time, indigenous cultures in Canada, they were considered as as wards of the crown, because it was assumed that they didn't know what was best for them. They didn't know how to deal with the land. They didn't have the same systems of property that were very common to the Europeans. So in that sense, another idea starts to appear, this idea of the white man's burden, right? It's an idea coming from the social evolutionist way of thinking that was still very much accepted in Europe, right? Some of those initial degrees in terms of how anthropology was being created as a discipline were still very much influenced by these notions of social evolutionism that tended to see cultures in only one way of development. So there was not this idea of cultures understood in the plural, like it started to happen already in the beginning of the 20th century, but not around that time. So they would only understand indigenous cultures as always in comparison with the European cultures, but always put in a degree as if they were inferior, inferior in the sense that, yes, anybody said something?
No, it was an exclamation from me that closest to the computer that here in South America, for sure was the same thing. They considered inferior to the rest of the European people here, but was about the Catholic Church to implant that idea here too.
Yeah, exactly. And exactly, the religion system was also another perspective that they were considered inferior. So in that sense, their spiritual beliefs were considered not the right ways to practice spirituality. So that this was also very important, as we will see very briefly here, in terms of how the residential school system worked. Right, one of the main practices of the residential school system, they were supposed to kidnap. That's the correct term, right? All the families, they were obliged. It was mandatory for them to send their kids to school when they were at the age of 6, and they would only return back to their families when they were 14 years old. They could still see their families in the summer vacation that would last about 45 days in the middle of the year. But what happened in these residential schools, as what Ricardo was saying, the religion was strongly imposed on them, and they were severely punished if they practiced their traditional religious systems. Right, so it also associates with this general idea, as I mentioned, the white man's burden. Why is it called the white man's burden? Right, in a similar way as it happened also in North America, the Europeans were invested with that mission, that they would be given this option, right, to this savage, ignorant native cultures in South America and also in Canada, that they would be given the option to achieve higher stages of civilization if they accepted the cultural system of the European nations. Right? That's why, in this sense, for the Europeans, they were doing something good for the Native Americans, in that sense that they were offering them this opportunity to burn a lot of stages and become civilized much quicker than if they just kept doing their culture. That would take a long time. So whenever European settlers, they would look at different cultures, especially indigenous cultures, they would always see them as if it was the European culture many years before. There's something that we refer in anthropology as a time machine effect, right? You're looking at others, not trying to understand them based on their own terms, not trying to understand their culture based on the meanings that they provide to the nature, to the politics, economics, and so on. You're always looking at them as if they were inferior to your culture in many different ways.
Yes, yes. Excuse me, Federico, but I just want to remind you of that, just for to know that in the previous class we was discussing about this situation about the Wounded Knee in the United States, where the army kills to the people, the indigenous people who was meeting there, and was the last war against the communities in the United States about all this genocide that you are telling us before. I think that they share and the same history is not depend from where they live in, just in Canada or in North America, but here in Latin America too, because they was seen by the same idea from their condition of inferiority when they compare or establish this Eurocentrism about the ideas from England or from Spanish too.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. These are some of the aspects that we can say it's very common, it's very general. Right? If we try to analyze the process of colonization the way it happened in North America and Latin America, and even Australia too, because Australia was also a country colonized by the British domain, so that it was very similar. This same approach that the Australian Aboriginals, they had a similar problem. They were treated in a very similar way. Even this notion of residential schools is something that also applied there in a different way. But this idea that, like I said, it's not necessarily just killing them, but let's transform them and use them to serve the values that we consider to be important values of what, in terms of how we consider individuals to be civilized or not. But just another example, as Ricardo was also saying about religion, right? There is this very important practice normally that's more applied in the cultures of the West Coast and of Canada, the West Coast, close to British Columbia and Vancouver, around that area. That's called probably must have heard if you are learning more in anthropology about the potlatch. That was widely described by Franz Boas, right? And in this practice of the potlatch, the villages, right? Each community they would, during certain special occasions that were happening in their community, they would invite guests from other communities when they would throw very big parties that are known as the potlatches. And in these parties, they would give away everything that they had as a sign of generosity. And the more generosity they would show during these potlatches, the more prestige and status they would gain among the other villages. But this value that in Western capitalist cultures we consider very important, these values of accumulation. The more you have, the more you should feel as a rich person. It was exactly the opposite, right? The less you have, the more you give, the more prestige, the more status you would receive among the cultures of the West Coast. And I'm just saying this just to highlight how practices like this, they were completely banned and abolished by the British Crown, because they were considered completely opposites to what was expected from the British Crown to impose their domain, to impose their ideologies over the indigenous nation. So the potlatch was completely banned because they wanted individuals to be materialistic, capitalistic, focused on working, accumulation, developing material possessions, and something that, of course, we are very familiar with that nowadays. But that luckily, some cultures, they still try to preserve these principles of not being so much worried about this and much more concerned about relations and the land, and something that we can still observe in several examples. Yes, if it's at some point you guys feel like saying something or asking a question, I'm going to stop from time to time also to ask if you have anything, instead of just asking questions in the end. If something that you really feel it's somehow related to what we are discussing, you can also ask questions or make any comments if you feel comfortable. Yeah, so I was talking about this white man's burden, which was one of the main driving ideologies supporting the British way to deal with indigenous nations. So there are even some authors that work directly with that in terms of how the image of the indigenous cultures changed over the years, guided by the convenience of the Europeans. Right? If in the past, the time of the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara, it was convenient to recognize indigenous cultures as equals, because the Europeans did not have all the structure to colonize and to dominate them. At this point, around the 1830s, 1840s, the Europeans start to realize that's better to treat them as inferiors, right? To justify this kind of domination, saying that they needed to be taken care of, right? They could not take care of their own future, so they needed to be considered as wards of the crown. And like I said, this ideology of the white man's burden served really well. So another quote that is there from the reading, right, from another one of the colonizers, saying Amerindians are an untaught unwary race among population ready and able to be able to take every advantage of them. Basically saying that they needed to be taken care of. They were savages. They needed direction from the white man. So in that sense, they needed to be controlled by the state, by the whole bureaucratic apparatus coming from the British Crown. Another important date there is that the control of the Indian affairs was transferred to Canada, or like the federal government, let's put it this way, in 1860. But the unification of the administration did not actually occur in practice. So it took 2 years for a single office to be established, and the colonies were still in the process of formation. Right? But initially, and even nowadays, all the subjects associated with indigenous affairs here in Canada, they are supposed to be taken care by the federal government and not by the provinces. Right? I don't know how it works there. In Colombia, I can say that in Brazil, it's the same thing. It's also a federal jurisdiction, indigenous affairs, and not about Indian title to the land. The commissioners from Great Britain, they needed to know who was an Indian. Right? So that's also associated with another very important document that passed in 1876 that became known as the Indian Act. Right? And the Indian Act was considered a very decisive policy to try to assimilate, to conquer the indigenous cultures in Canada, because the Indian Act was, among many other things, was trying to define who is and aggressive policy, especially if you think about discussions nowadays about identity, how identities should be defined. All policies and judgments and evaluations like this that are coming from the outside are normally considered very dangerous, right, in that sense, because whenever something, imagine somebody or any kind of policy coming from the government and telling you who you are, right, basically is stripping away that possibility, stealing from you that possibility to define who you are based on the terms that you consider important, right? Just think about this, suffering this in your own skin, and that's something pretty scary, right? Just basically, if a person considers themselves to be indigenous, even though they have an indigenous background, they practice their spirituality, they speak the language, and so on. But then the government comes and say, no, you're not an indigenous person because your father is not indigenous, right? One of the criteria to define who was and who wasn't indigenous person was this criteria named as the blood quantum, the amount of indigenous blood that you have in your background, in your ancestry. That's something completely arbitrary, but if the father, for example, of that person was not indigenous, that person was not considered indigenous, and it didn't matter what they said about that. So it's a very strong imposition in trying to control indigenous identities. So that's the first criteria. So there are 4 criteria that are explained here. First one is the blood quantum. The second one, people married with indigenous peoples and their descendants, people with indigenous ancestry living among indigenous, and all persons adopted by indigenous residing in indigenous land. So these were the ones that are considered indigenous based on these classifications coming from the Indian Act. So even nowadays, it exists here in Canada, and the act is still valid, right? And then normally you need to have a card to prove that you are an indigenous person, and that card is going to say Indian status or Indian non-status, right? So even if you are Indian non-status, there are some benefits, some recognitions that you can access. But for those who are considered Indian status, you have more benefits and more support from the government based on some of these criteria that were established way back then. And it's still valid nowadays to define who is an indigenous person and who is not. And in 1857, the government issued an act or legislation trying to exchange a vote for Indian status. Right? So for an individual, an indigenous individual to be allowed to vote, that person needed to give up their indigenous identity so they could vote to elect the leaders of the country. You can see how problematic that is. So this is also part of these policies to try to control and assimilate the indigenous cultures in Canada. So there are even some authors. It's not there in these readings that you are assigned to read, but I think that one interesting way to look at this in terms of these policies of assimilation, that one of the authors talk about this, the three pillars of colonization. The first one is the Indian Act, right? By the Indian Act, the purpose is to steal the identities of the indigenous cultures, basically not allowing them to define who they are, but telling them who they are from external traits, external characteristics that are more important for the government. The second pillar would be the residential schools, right? By stealing their kids, stealing their culture, teaching them new values, teaching them new forms of education, teaching them new forms of spirituality, and punishing them severely if they spoke the language, punishing them severely if they didn't cut their long and braided hairs. So yeah, so the first one, Indian Act, the second one, residential schools, and the third one is the treaties, right? The treaties, we're going to see more about them, but the treaties is let's steal their land, right? So basically the first one, Indian Act, let's steal their identity. Residential schools, let's steal their cultures. And by the treaties, let's steal their land. So these are considered like the three pillars of the process of colonization, the way it happened here in Canada, without necessarily having to take control, conquer, and kill the majority of indigenous cultures here in Canada. But in many ways, many scholars, they say it was very effective, and it could be considered even more violent than just killing, conquering, and exerting other forms of colonization that we are normally more familiar in North America and South America. You guys have any thoughts, any questions?
That we can share with Federico? Please talk high, because we can hear you. You can close here if you prefer.
No, it's for you. Maybe you can give us 5 minutes to make a question for him, because there is a lot of information and we can.
Okay, you need to process it.
Yes.
Okay, Federico, please give us 5 minutes to can processing some ideas and can make a retroalimentation, some doubts from you on any approach. Okay, thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, you can get 5 minutes to create some questions or some ideas that you can share with us with Federico. Please, you can do it. Thanks. Yes, it's a very interesting point. While they are create the question or something like, we can talk about some things that they're really very interesting for your interview today, and for the reading. That's the idea. But I always like to know, because I never saw that in my career for anthropologists, how was the process in Brazil? Because I don't know, because we are talking about this colonization in South America, in America in general, but this Tordesillas Agreement separate from the Catholic Church and for the Orthodox maybe. And Brazil has a very different way to establish the colonization too, but it's not an answer that we can solve now in this interview. But for me, it's gonna be very, really important understand how was the process there in Brazil, because we are seeing that it's not the same, but it was almost the same for all the people in the rest of America. But I would like to know how was the process in Brazil, because I think that's going to be very different, or I don't know. Can you tell me
there are some similarities, some differences. We can even maybe in the future plan another class for discuss the Brazilian case, but exactly that there are some aspects that are similar, especially the way the arrival of the Europeans arrived in the northeast coast, and then they came down to the southeast part of Brazil. So that part was where the indigenous cultures, they were very much exterminated in the process of 100 to 100 years, right? not a lot of indigenous cultures left in that area, but the more the central part and the part in the Amazon, it took them a lot more time to get there, and those are the ones that were able to preserve their cultures and be able to manage a little bit more efficiently the process of colonization and assimilation. The state was not very present. There was always this ideologies to colonize, to develop the country, to civilize, always looking at indigenous cultures as backwards, where they didn't need to be there anymore. But still something that we unfortunately we still see nowadays, but not in the same way as we had a chance to see here in Canada. Because in Canada, the process was more formal. It went through a series of legislations that were approved by the parliament. This whole process of the treaties, the administration, the definition in terms of how their lands were going to be defined. So this process, I think it was more formal in Canada than in Brazil.
Okay. Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
But we can think about another
you.
class to give more details about Brazil for sure.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, yes, we had a question here. Okay, Maria Paz, she's gonna ask you some questions. Please, you can close here for Federico hear you because the mic is on the computer.
Okay, so hi. In order we're gonna be teachers, I'm going to ask you something that I need to know or I want to know. And here with the discovery of America, the Europe idea, they try to make us combines of teach that the people was discovered or even invited. But I don't know in there with the Amerindians happened the same thing on the history classes with the students in the schools, not even in the high school or not even in the university or stuff. But I don't know if the teachers still teach the Eurocentric way, or they teach the real story about the Amerindians and the old thing about Indian teacher. In here, they tell us about you were discovered by Spanish people and you were invited or you didn't exist even after that. And I want you to know that in the schools, they maybe teach the real story about the Amerindians.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Maria, thanks. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, I can say a little bit about that.
Excuse me, Federico, please let me here. Maybe one part of my students don't have basis in English, so let me translate the questions that Maria Paz did. La pregunta de Maria Paz es muy importante porque ella quiere saber eventualmente cómo se está enseñando el tema indígena en los colegios o en la educación en Canadá o en Estados Unidos. Es decir, si se está contando la realidad de todas estas muertes, de todos estos genocidios, de todo lo que estamos viendo, o cómo es que enseñan allá el tema étnico. Y es muy importante para que también podamos mirar un poco qué es lo que estamos enseñando acá. Eventualmente, qué tan realística, digamos, de acuerdo a estas historias, se enseñan en los colegios o no. Esa es la pregunta de María Paz. Yes. Okay, thanks a lot, Federico.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. For me, I didn't do my school here in Canada. In the same way as you, I learned when I was in Brazil, having history lessons, history classes, that Brazil was discovered, and probably in the same way that you have learned in your schools. But from when I like to ask this question to my students, so that's why I think I can say a little bit about that, how they learned about the history of the country, if they had learned anything about the histories of the treaties, of the Royal Proclamation, and all these topics that we're discussing here today. And many of them said, especially if they are a little bit older, right, they say that they learned mostly from the perspective of the colonizer. Even these ideas of being discovered, nothing about the treaties. Even when they learn about the treaties, what they learn about the treaties is only the perspective of the European settlers, as if the Amerindian cultures, they accepted the treaties in peace, they recognized the superiority of the Europeans, and they were happy to give up or to surrender big parts of their territories, and they were happy to do this for the protection of the crown. Right? That's not true. Right? That's the perspective of the Europeans, but it seems to be changing more recently. Right? In a number of ways, we're seeing very strong initiatives coming from indigenous movements, indigenous leaders. And just more recently, I'm starting to notice that here. I'm living in Canada, not for a long time, but I live here for about 13 years, almost 14 years. So when I arrived here, it wasn't like that. I could see the gradual changes, and nobody actually would like to talk about indigenous peoples. They're normally considered like a problem to the country, living far away, or normally when they lived in the cities were considered individuals that were not supposed to be there in the city. They should be going back to their reserves. But more recently, we were seeing a very strong movement of that. My son goes to school. He is, for example, he's 9 years old, and he tells me that every day before they start the classes, everybody has to stop, and they hear in the speaker system of the school, right, saying that we should honor the land that we are here right now. This land belongs to this and that particular indigenous people. So this place, this ground that we are staying right now was originally the ground of indigenous people, to start creating this kinds of awareness in individuals since they are young, that hopefully when they become adults, they can become more sensitive about this. Right. So I have also asked my students in terms of how they learned about the history, and for those ones that are younger, I think we can say that it's starting to change. Right, more people are becoming more aware. They're learning more about the history in a way that is not necessarily from the perspective of the colonizer. So I think it's a good thing. That's still a long way to go, but we're noticing that things are changing gradually.
Okay,
Okay,
thanks.
so
Okay, yes, you got another question? Daily, if you can come close, please.
Okay. Hi, Federico.
hi.
My name is Daily. And well, as you know, the conquer and the colonization was very hard for all those Amerindians or bands. Yes, the recognition of the rights or the ethnician, it wasn't very easy, and they wanted to find a way to be free and get some benefits from the government. Here in Colombia, we just have a recognition since maybe it's supposed it's 1991, but just in 2016 we had a treatment with all those Amerindians group of bands here in Colombia, and we are still living in a war. Because the government kills our indigenous, and we had another group that kill us, right? And my question is, does the government in the Canada still killing Amerindians currently? And another question is, there is still discrimination, exclusion between Amerindians and non-Amerindians? And how is the young people with all those groups currently or lately, whatever?
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Daily. Okay, I'm gonna make the translation here for the class. Lo que David está preguntando un poco es, digamos, bueno, en primer lugar, pues la situación está estableciendo una comparación entre lo que sucede acá en Colombia, en donde, digamos, se han asesinado a muchos indígenas en sus comunidades por grupos que son los grupos que tenemos aquí en Colombia, como las guerrillas y grupos paramilitares. Entonces, ellos han asesinado y asesinan a líderes indígenas. Entonces, ella pregunta un poco cómo es este tema allí en Canadá, es decir, si el gobierno canadiense tiene alguna política en donde hay una guerra, una guerra en contra de los indígenas que haya sido una guerra armada. Uno, pregunta si hay eso. Y dos, también se pregunta si hay actualmente, recientemente, si todavía hay, digamos, como esta visión de los indígenas a un lado frente a los que no son indígenas, si todavía hay, digamos, alguna clase de racismo o de discriminación por su condición étnica en Canadá, ahora y en los jóvenes actualmente en Canadá, ¿no? Mm, Yo después de eso, pues no ahorita, porque tenemos apenas 2 horas, pero también les podría comentar un poquito algunas de las experiencias that I read it about the experience from the indigenous who lives they call it the urban indigenous urban indigenous, but they are the young people, and they got a lot of fights against, and they try to recover these rights for them. So, y después les puedo comentar un poquito algo que he estado leyendo sobre esos procesos de gente joven, sobre todo el centro de Young People in Canada, que está en Toronto, y tiene algunas iniciativas de gente muy joven en la ciudad haciendo cosas para reivindicar sus derechos. Entonces, thanks, Federico.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can do this. I'd like to hear also about your experiences, Ricardo. Yeah, I can see the class is very interested, very good questions. So we can even make this more, if you see that there's more people interested, I can just go more quickly here on the part of the treaties, and I assume you all read the chapter. So just to expand a little bit more on the treaties, and you can even go back to some more questions, more examples, can make this into an even more interactive conversation than just me lecturing here, which I'd like very much to hear more perspectives about this. But yeah, I can answer the question and then finish the part of the treaty, and then we can see if there's more opening for more debates, and you can even talk about your examples. Ricardo, does that work?
Yes, it's perfect, Federico. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so based on...
Los tratados y después vemos las preguntas para que él termine su presentación. Yes, we are ready.
Yeah, in terms of this, the question, I think we can also see some similarities between Colombia and Brazil too, with some indigenous leaders being murdered in some cases, especially those that are very vocal to defend their rights. So they are sometimes against very powerful interests in the country. Sometimes we hear examples of these individuals being killed. We can say here in Canada, it doesn't work so much like this. We seem to have more recognition in that sense. It not so much violence in that sense, individuals being killed, but the government, it's still very hesitant, right? They're still very slow in actually recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples, in really recognizing the importance to have a more open dialogue. It doesn't happen so much in this terms, these acts of violence, but more of restricting indigenous ways to participate more openly and equally in the Canadian society. So having said that, exactly because of these 3 pillars that I have mentioned, Canada has created this huge gap, this huge separation between indigenous individuals and non-indigenous individuals in Canada. If you're going to look at the statistics in the country in terms of social, economic statistics of the individuals that are indigenous and non-indigenous, you're going to look at the levels of education, health. If you're going to compare the health systems, the health capacity of these 2 groups. What else? If you're going to compare the rates of imprisonment, incarceration, individuals that go to jail, much higher if you take the population of indigenous peoples and non-indigenous. If you're going to look at the jails, the vast majority of the individuals, they are indigenous, not because they have any kind of inclination to be violent, but the way that they are inserted in the society is completely distorted, right? It doesn't make sense with their own cultures. So this huge gap is still a big challenge for the government to try to approach the 2 groups, right? And it's important to consider, probably Canada would not even exist as a country if it wasn't for the strong participation of the indigenous nations. There was this war that was called the War of 1812, where the United States tried to take possession of Canada, and it didn't work. They lost that war, but the indigenous leaders, they were very important to protect Canada, to avoid that Canada would be part of United States around that time, and many other aspects, right? It's easy for many people in Canada to recognize that Canada is a country of multiculturalism, right? This is a term that very often we hear and people like to celebrate, because there's a lot of people from different countries living in Canada, like the city that I live here in Toronto, right? That there are people from very different nationalities, from China, India, Iran, Portugal, Italy, many countries, and people live relatively well with each other. There are some limitations. Some cultures, they tend to be more closed than others, but overall, the life is very nice. There's a lot of respect, a lot of recognition. But when it comes to talk about indigenous peoples, indigenous cultures, that's something that not a lot of people want to talk about it. They don't want to know about it. It's very common in the general discussions, people saying, oh yes, here comes again indigenous movement of people just trying to ask for more money, asking for more benefits. What else do they want? Right? What else are they gonna ask? Haven't we given them everything? So there's a lot of misunderstanding about the history in terms of how their land was stolen, their culture was stolen. So there's still this process of separation. There's still, in some smaller cities like Thunder Bay, that I had a chance to live in Thunder Bay for 5 years before I moved down here to Aurelia, down closer to Toronto. So there's a large number of the population of Thunder Bay is indigenous, and the other part is from European ancestry. And there are some very strong tensions there between those two populations, of very significant racism that you can observe. Even if you're not even paying attention, you can see it very clearly in the daylight. The racism exists. Here in Toronto, not so much, but it's still this kind of tension, lots of misunderstandings. And so there's still a long way to go for the government to work together with indigenous cultures to help to reparate and to fix this very damaged relationship that started with the Indian Act, residential schools, and the treaties. Okay, so can I go here, and then we open in the end for more questions, more comments? Yeah, okay, so let me go.
We can go
Okay,
ahead.
so,
Thanks.
The first treaties that were signed in terms of the large treaties were considered like the Robinson treaties, right? There are other treaties are also signed in smaller dimensions, but the Robinson treaties, they became very important because they were considered like the foundation for the other big treaties. And the Robinson treaties, they encompassed this notion of reserves that were something that the government granted them. So they were simply lands that Amerindians had not shared with the newcomers. So that's also another aspect that, if we compare with South America, it's very different. In Brazil, for example, when you're talking about reserve is all the area that group can use for their livelihood, everything that they need. Right here in Canada, reserve is a very, very small land reserved for the community to live in, just with a few houses, some areas where they can go out and fish and hunt, but it's normally very, very small. And then they can go out of the reserve limits if they prove that they're using those lands for the purposes of hunting and fishing and developing other activities that are essential for their livelihood. But there's always that tension when the government realized that at any point, right, that the lands outside of the reserve, they have some kind of interest for the government, then the indigenous peoples, they cannot go there anymore. So that was one of the main definitions of treaties like this, like the Robinson treaties, is that they would be, the indigenous groups would be agreeing to surrender, to give up very large portions of their land. So just for you to have an idea, normally they would be giving up 95% of their territory, traditional territories, and would be staying with 5% that would encompass the limits of the reserve. And the terms of these treaties, they were followed later on. So the Robinson treaties were signed in 1850, and the other treaties were signed So at this point, again, there was not even Canada, right? So the other treaties were started to be signed in 1871. So that's, yeah, then we already had Canada. So Canada established itself as an independent, not independent country because it's still attached to the British monarchy, but autonomous country in 1867. Right, so around this time, the government realized that they need to start signing these treaties to take possession of indigenous land. So all those territories that were granted in the Royal Proclamation, so that's going back to the Proclamation 1763. So these Indian titles, they were supposed to be extinguished with the signing of the treaties, and the basis of these treaties were the Robinson Treaties. So the Robinson Treaties encompass like the northern part of the provinces like Ontario, like Thunder Bay, for example, encompasses this area of the Robinson Treaties, not the southern part of Canada, more for the northern part, but not the part that is the Arctic, right? It's called the subarctic part of Canada, not so to the south, but not so much to the north. So this is the area that started to be encompassed by the Robinson Treaties and other treaties. So the administration, the reserves were crucial agreement in an effort to civilize the Indians and the means to secure the white man's freedom to explore the resources in Aboriginal territory. So the strategy of the treaties was exactly this, right? To find a way to eliminate, to conquer, to take possession of indigenous territories so that Canada could establish itself as a country and develop economically, right? The idea to develop economically means to exploit natural resources, and Canada is a very large country with a variety of natural resources coming from hydro development, forestry, right, logging, mining activities. So these are activities that are very strong here in Canada, and they still challenge in great measures the indigenous sovereignty and control over their traditional territories. So these are some of the general principles supporting the Robinson Treaties that could also be observed in all of the other treaties that were coming after this one. So negotiations were open and public meetings were held. Lands were surrendered only to the crown. A schedule of the reserves to be held in common was annexed with each treaty. Each member of the signing band received annuities. Hunting, fishing, and trapping rights were granted outside the limits of the reserve. So that's what I'm saying. The reserve was so small, so they can't survive just by using this very small territory assigned for the reserve. So they could go, they could use the limits out of the reserve up to the point if the crown did not show any interest in those lands. So if they realized that the crown decides that they wanted to use those lands for any other kind of economic development, then those groups would not be allowed anymore to use these particular areas. Another point that I'd like to highlight here is item number 4. Like each member of the signing band received annuities. Right? That's also a very controversial point here, because prior to that, the common practice was to have this annual exchange of gifts, where the government or the crown would come and provide some gifts to the members of those communities. But to try to make things more simple, they decided to establish a fixed amount that each member would receive every year. For the Robinson Treaties, if I remember correctly, the amount was $5, right? Imagine 1850. At that time, it was $5. It was a good money at that time. And for the other treaties, sometimes it was going to be $5, other times it was going to be $4. But what happened is that even nowadays, right, they still receive the same $5, $4 every year. Imagine, right, how insulting a policy like this still sounds in the ears of indigenous peoples. And every year they have to go to the office and they receive $4 or $5 because they have surrendered a huge amounts of their territories, right? Sometimes people, they even joke about this, saying, yeah, I think I'm going to wait 10 years and then I'm going to pick up $50 after 10 years have passed, because it's such a big offensive policy that still persists nowadays. So Amerindians considered in a distinct separate category, that of wardship, and became a federal responsibility. So they were still considered wards of the crown and responsibility of the federal government in that sense, right? So the government was responsible for taking care of them, They were dependent on the decisions from the government. At that time, there was even this system that became, and nowadays it doesn't exist anymore, but it was very enforced at that time. That was considered like a pass system, where every individual, right, if you lived in a reserve and you have family members living in another reserve, you always needed to have the permission from the Indian Affairs agent to leave your reserve and visit another person if you wanted to go to the city. So you're basically trapped, right? You're basically imprisoned in your own reserve. In many ways, we can also associate the ways that the reserves were created to those ghettos that were very commonly used during the Second World War, right? Basically to restrict the Jewish families from the regular access to the city. So they were basically entrapped in particular areas in the towns, and they couldn't go outside. The same thing happened with the reserves around that time, 1850s, 1860s, very close to the 20th century. So you can see that people were basically living inside this reserve, but they were trapped inside there. They could not go out. So that's the kind of treatment that the government wanted to give to the indigenous populations. So a few more about that. So the first numbered treaties in the Indian Act. So after that, we started to have the numbered treaties. So it's very simple. So we have nowadays 11 treaties that were signed. Each treaty receives a name based on the number 1 to 11, and exactly based on the date that they were signed. So the chronology basically directs the number and how they're signed. Each one of the treaties, they also received a specific name. Like the one that I can remember is the one that I work more closely with is Treaty 9. That's also referred to as James Bay Treaty. So each one of the treaties, they also have a number and a name associated with them. So yeah, so by 1870s, the treaties were seen by the government as the final policy to define the terms of Aboriginal lands for settlement and development by extinguishing Amerindian land title. So that's what the treaties were supposed to do from the perspective of the Crown. Again, it's very important to notice as something that Maria was asking, right? The perspective of the indigenous nations, they're not agreeing to cede or release their titles, right? They were agreeing to share the land with the Europeans, and that's very important. But that part of the agreement was completely ignored by the British settlers. In many situations, the promises were made orally by the commissioners who are representing the British Crown. They were saying to the indigenous leader that they didn't need to worry. They're not going to lose access to their traditional lands. So, but what was actually written on the original text of the treaties was very dubious, right? There was a lot of doubts. And in all of these occasions, of course, the indigenous members, they did not understand English. The process of translation was normally made by missionaries, by individuals that were representing the interests of the colony. So they had their own interests to make the translations that were more favorable to the British Crown. So this impacted in a very important way how the indigenous nations decided to accept the terms of the treaty. So many authors, they say that they were tricked, right? They lied to them about how the treaties were going to be made and that they're going to be losing the access to their lands, because if they were told the truth, very likely they're not going to be accepting the terms of the treaty. So just to make sure that I'm emphasizing this point, whenever we're talking about the treaties, there are two sides, right? There's the side from the Crown that the lands were surrendered and the indigenous leaders agreed to surrender and give up big portions of their land, and the perspective of the indigenous cultures that they were agreeing to share the land with the newcomers, and that's very important nowadays. Yeah, so in the government's view, the treaties granted privileges. In the indigenous views, it protected their rights, right? And this is a very common discussion in law when we're talking about indigenous law, and even law in general. If a particular situation is a privilege or a right, right? For example, if you're driving is a privilege, right? Not a right. If you do it wrong, if you don't drive properly, so this privilege is going to be removed from you, right? And then in a similar way, right, for the indigenous peoples, they were just asserting their rights, their rights to the land. And for the government, it was giving them the privilege to use the land that that was already recognized as the crown land. Right? Hopefully this distinction is clear. So if you guys want to emphasize this a little bit more, we can discuss this more in the final part. So the Indian Act 1876 already talked a little bit about that, but just expand on some of the general issues of the Indian Act. So the concepts like band and reserve. Band is more like the general political arrangement of the structure, and reserve is actually the territory that they're going to be using. Right. So this is the general map of the treaties, how they were signed in Canada. If you take a look, I don't know if you can see it properly, this, especially the blue lines. The blue lines here, they represent the limits of the treaties and the numbers, right? If you take a look here, Treaty 9, this area here, right, that covers most of Ontario, and then Treaty 5 also covers the Manitoba province, Treaty 6, Treaty 8. So if you look at it, you can see that the province here of British Columbia, the province in the very west of Canada, there's a lot of spaces, a lot of areas that were not covered by the treaties. If you take a look at the Arctic region of Canada, parts of Quebec, large parts were not covered by the treaties. So these are also the parts of the communities that are demanding other forms of recognition of their rights, because they don't want to be part of this system, or they're expected to surrender large portions of their territory. This also created a number of conflictuous situations with the government. So in certain ways, they want to find some kind of agreements with the government, but they don't want to give up their traditional lands in these areas that haven't signed the treaties.
Excuse me, Federico, where is Toronto there in that map?
Okay, just go back here. Yes, if you look here, right, so this Toronto is very much to the south here. Can you see the arrow of the of the mouse here? Yeah, it's very much close to this. I don't know exactly where it is, because there's some of these parts here, because it is very close to the limit of the United States, right? Toronto is very close to the border. So yeah, so it should be closer to this southern part. Oh, here's more like Thunder Bay area. Yeah, it's more here to this southern part, but Toronto is not part of any of these treaties.
Okay, so there was a part of the first treaties, maybe.
Yeah, no, yeah,
Yes?
Toronto and the southern part of Ontario. No, there was no treaties. More for the northern part, going a little bit north, but not the southern Ontario.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, and then the definition of band: body of Amerindians for whom the government has set aside lands for their common use and benefit, and reserve tract of land that the crown has set aside for use and benefit of the band. Right. So it's like I said, reserve is actually the ground, the territory, and the band is more about the political structure. So the Indian Act was established as the legal foundation for a huge bureaucratic apparatus that contributed to maintain the Indians in an abject state of dependency from the federal government. So the idea of the Indian Act was exactly this: to create dependency, to create separation, to keep them isolated from the rest of the population, and to define who is and who is not an Indian. But above all, these were all policies that had this idea that to be an indigenous person was always something temporary. Right? There was never this understanding here in Canada that the future of the country would be a future where indigenous cultures would exist. So there's always in the minds of the government and the crown to create the mechanisms to eliminate the culture and think about the future of the country without indigenous cultures. There's always this idea that something temporary, or this idea to absorb, to assimilate, right? And unfortunately, it didn't work. Right? It didn't work, but it brought a lot of problems, a lot of traumas, a lot of separation that that we can see all the consequences nowadays. Yeah, so in 1869, the government instituted an elective system for selection of chiefs and band councils. That part is also important, because what happened is that instead of trying to understand, and many governments, they do that, instead of trying to understand the diversity of every nation that existed in Canada, to understand their systems of leadership, their political forms of organization, right? Who is the chief? Who are the leaders? How the political structure is organized? And instead of trying to understand that, the government issued this elective system that was supposed to to eliminate all the political structures that were considered traditional, and to impose a system of how the chiefs were going to be elected and the band councils, right? So basically, a chief was elected, and depending on the number of the members of this community, let's say that they had 300 members. So for each 100 members, they would be allowed to elect one counselor. So if they had 300, it would be one chief and 3 counselors, and so on. So this system was part of the Indian Act. So they're also part of the process of assimilation. So instead of the government trying to understand the political system of all the nations in Canada, that let's just impose one system, so that's easy to control, it's easy to deal with them, it's easy to manipulate them. And of course, this created a series of problems, right? And some groups, they have very strong attachment to their political systems, like the groups of the West Coast, like the Iroquois, like that's part of the Mohawks. They wouldn't give up their system so easily. Of course, they had to accept the terms of the Indian Act, but their systems, they would still work as parallel systems to provide decisions and to guide the community in terms of political decisions. So this also created internal tensions in the community, right? In cases where the chief and the council, they would approve, let's say, a development of a pipeline or development of a forestry company coming to their territories, but then the traditional system would not allow that to happen. But the government would still do it anyways, because it was the official system of the Indian Act that was approving this kind of initiatives that could bring a lot of harm to their territory. So this is also part of these unilateral policies imposed by the government and to assimilate the cultures. And of course, controlling the political system is a very a strategic part of this plan. Yeah, so there was this failure of the Indian Act to assimilate the Indians, which is considered a positive thing. But the system, unfortunately, was able to cause a lot of damage, right? The system in itself separated the groups from the rest of Canada. Even the groups were fighting among themselves, right, to see who was going to be recognized as Indian status and non-status, so how they're going to be receiving some kinds of benefits from the government or not. So it also ended up creating a lot of tensions among the indigenous nations themselves that are still trying to fix nowadays. Yeah, so in terms of this contradiction of the Indian Act regulations, right, we can talk in a number of ways about this, because they're trying to assimilate the population, but they couldn't recognize the whole diversity that existed in Canada. They were not actually very efficient in assimilating the groups to the Canadian mainstream society. But on the other hand, they were very efficient in informing individuals that later on will become very vocal, very important to defend the indigenous rights. In a similar way as the residential school systems, they were effective in creating a lot of traumas for the populations, but those who were able to survive and overcome those traumas, they became very strong leaders, because they managed to navigate. They understand how the European system works without necessarily abandoning, right, the indigenous way to deal with the land and to deal with these important relationships. They were still able to navigate, and they became very important figures to try to make things right, and they became very important members to try to take lead of the indigenous movement in Canada. Right, let me just see if there's something else important here, because I think we can stop at this point. There are more things that I could say, but I'd just like to talk a little bit, just to close here, about the Treaty of Niagara, and then we can open for some discussions and questions. So as I mentioned previously, the Treaty of Niagara was signed in 1764, right? It was like the counterpart of the indigenous counterpart of the Royal Proclamation. So there was a multinational alliance established between the settlers and the First Nations. Imagine this, 1764, there were more than 2,000 indigenous leaders that moved all the way from Canada and United States to meet at Niagara to ratify, to confirm the terms of the Royal Proclamation, recognizing their rights, and also they recognize the arrival of the European settlers and their desire to share the land with them. So that's a very important principle that we hear very often here in Canada, this idea, this purpose to share the land that has been constantly ignored by the European settlers. It's not to say that they want the Europeans to go away, we want the country back to us. It's much more about this recognition by be more active members of the society, and this idea of sharing the Canadian culture, but also recognizing Indigenous culture as an important form, as an important element to form the general identity of what it means to be a Canadian. So William Johnson presented the terms of the Royal Proclamation, and a promise of peace was given to Aboriginal leaders, and a state of mutual non-interference was established. So these were the original terms. So this is one of the pictures of the wampum belt. So these were belts that were exchanged in this very important occasion. Right, the way to understand the belt, if you take a look at these two rows, these two purple rows, separated by the white row. So each one of these purple rows represent a vessel, a ship, right, a boat. Each one of these purple rows represent, one is going to be the European settlers, the other one is going to be the Indigenous nations. It's important to recognize that the separation, as if they are navigating in the same ocean, but they are separated, right? It means that they are respecting each other, they are friends, but they are not interfering with each other's business. So that was the general term of this agreement when the wampums were exchanged between the Europeans and Indigenous nations. And this symbol of the wampum is very much remembered nowadays when the Indigenous peoples are trying to go back to the past and recall everything that was agreed in 1764 and conveniently was forgotten or ignored by the European settlers to try to impose their domain, their control over the Indigenous nations in Canada. Right, so I think we can close with that and see if there are any questions. We can expand a little bit more on that.
First, Federico, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your interview, for your presentation, for sharing with us the ideas about how was the situation for the American people, for the First Nations there, and especially the relevant points about the discussion between the Indigenous people right now against the measure there with the government for the recognition of their own rights. And that is a really important thing. Have this historical review about the more important treaties, the treaties that they got. And in fact, I think that with your explanation, we can imagine how it can be the movements there now. And I don't know, but the people, the communities who live in the upper part from Canada, in the north part, is I don't know, with this climatic change, I think that they got in a risk and a lot of risk about the recognition of the rights, because the weather is changed a lot there. It's diminished the weather, is changed a lot there, and the animals who depends on the lives too is moving away. And for sure they got problems to move between one territory to other, because there are companies there and they are not got the legal rights to use the resources there. So I think that it's a big problem for them. I don't know, I'm not sure, but they got movements, indigenous movements there. They are having conversations with the government, or how is these political ideas there?
Yeah, that's always a complicated issue. These communities that are more isolated, they tend to face more serious problems to survive it. They also receive some kind of assistance from the government, some even in the form of money, or there are even some jobs that they can work in the reserve, but there's not a lot of opportunities there, right? There are some of the reserves that are considered urban reserves that they have access to the cities. You can drive there back and forth. So it happens that some members they can work in the city, then they can go back to the reserve. So it can also help them to support their families. But in other cases of these communities that are more isolated, it is indeed very complicated. Exactly as you said, with global warming, with other kinds of economic development situations, right? Some populations, especially those that live more in the Arctic areas, that especially they used to depend a lot on the populations of caribou. Like caribou is a very close relative to the reindeer. So these animals, they travel in big packs, big groups. They have their special migrations during certain times of the year. But there are already some very well recognized reports saying that the populations of the caribous is going down significantly. But even if you take a look in terms of, I have a chance to visit one of these communities a few years ago, and they have their own stores there in the community, right? When sometimes people, they can go there and buy things, but the price is so high, it's really high how things can buy things there because of all the costs for transportation, right? They don't have any competition. Just for you to have an idea, just if you're going to buy like a jug of milk, right? 2 liters of milk would cost more than $20, right? Just a small pack of salad would be costing $10, right? So it's really expensive. People are not able to afford this. Yeah. And overall, yeah, there are some of trying to organizations to try to work closely with the governments to provide some more communication and other forms of opportunities for people living in these isolated reserves. And there's constantly this water boil advisories, right? Because then sometimes the water of the lakes are not in the best conditions for them to drink or to cook. So they have to be boiling the water all the time. That's something that really surprised me as soon as I arrived here in Canada, because there's so much fresh water all over the place. As soon as I arrived and I saw in the houses people with big stacks of spring water, like mineral water in their houses, that really called my attention in terms of, wow, you can't really drink the water. And they say, no, the water here on the lake, even though you look at the lake, it looks beautiful. The water looks very clear.
Yeah.
But they say there are developments of mining, sawmills and other developments that they throw chemicals in the water, right? So they are contaminating the fish. People, they cannot drink from the lake, so they need to have their water treatment stations, and when they're able to receive that kind of support. But in other cases, if it's too isolated to construct these structures there, it can be very complicated. So they can even have to be boiling the water, and even in the cases where more extreme, they have to be evacuated from the communities because people are getting sick, right? So there are even cases where some of these communities where people are having cancer, like neurological diseases because of the quality, the quality of the water.
Oh, incredible! It's incredible that. Okay. Do you have any question? Do you have to make another comment about this conversation that we got with Federico now? Ya estamos terminando la sesión. Quiero saber si hay preguntas, si hay algún comentario, algo adicional para, digamos, poder terminar la clase. Do you have any other question or something else that you can share with us? No, Federico, I think that is done. The students don't have any other questions, but it's a really important and significant participation, especially with your knowledge about the communities. This ethnographical data that you share with us about the water, it's incredible that the people living in the polar, they have to use and buy water. Yeah. Because they can use the water that they got in their own lakes because they're very contaminated now. So it's incredible that situation that you express us. I'm gonna translate a little because I see very sights. What? Federico acaba de mencionar una situación que él evidenció en un dato etnográfico en su trabajo con ellos allá. Y es que al llegar a las casas, algunas casas de algunos de estas familias indígenas, de esos pueblos indígenas de la parte polar, de la parte ártica, en sus casas tienen litros de agua, tanques, recipientes con agua para poder tomar. porque no pueden tomar el agua del lago que si tú la ves, está limpiecita, está clara, está transparente y diáfana, pero los indígenas saben que esa agua está contaminada por todo el proceso de minería que se genera alrededor para la extracción de los recursos. Lo que nos decía Federico al principio es que Canadá tiene un gran desarrollo frente al tema energético, al tema minero. Y entonces allá hay muchas compañías que están explotando el recurso, pero a la vez están contaminando el agua. Entonces la gente ya ni siquiera puede tomar el agua que está en la región del polo, de los lagos que hay allí, porque está contaminada por la minería. Por no hablar del Caribe, de un ciervo que hay allá, que es del cual depende la cacería de la gente, y las poblaciones de este ciervo han venido disminuyendo drásticamente. Y era, digamos, pero se ha disminuido mucho parte de lo que ellos cazan para sobrevivir en sus familias, en esas condiciones. Entonces, pues la situación es bastante complicada también allí en algunas cosas. But finally, I would like to know, Federico, if there is what are the possibilities for the people there? Because like everything's look worse, that going worse every time with the resources and everything. Why they propose about that? Their own changes, how they can survive, or how they are asked for the government to the recognition of any other kind of things for can living. That I think that is the more important thing here. How are they gonna live in there?
Yeah, that's one of the main issues, right? But the thing is that it looks like that each community is trying to find their own way. If you're going to compare with the government in South America, I think we can say there's a lot of advancement here in terms of policies, in terms of recognition of indigenous rights, but it's still a long way to go. In terms of, as I mentioned about the Indian Act, that it's still valid in Canada, this very oppressive policy, which is not a good thing, but some communities are trying to find their own ways to get rid of the Indian Act in terms of trying to establish their own models of self-governance, self-regulation in terms of how they're going to be addressing their own internal issues. So some of them are trying to get rid of the Indian Act, but trying to find their own ways to do it without this extensive control coming from the Canadian government, right? So we're seeing some examples that are serving to influence other groups when they really feel comfortable on doing this. It's not like they are establishing their own municipalities or anything that is independent from Canada, but they're just trying to require some more level of autonomy when they're trying to make their own decisions without having the government impose on them all the time certain measures that can make sense to other Canadians, but cannot necessarily make sense to their own practical ways and traditional ways to deal with the land and other internal issues. So this seems to be one way to do it, right? But the situation is still complicated. This separation that has been created over the years is really hard to deal with that, to compensate. Like based on one of the questions, the prejudice still persists, that this clear divide in the Canadian society is still there, especially in those cities that live very close to the reserves and they can see their daily lives, indigenous individuals coming and going. And there's a lot of things to be done. There's not a single recipe, but it looks like that trying to get rid of the Indian Act and trying to find their own ways to develop their systems of self-governance and self-determination is one way to go, but it has to be slowly and with each group defining their own ways and at their own pace.
Okay, no, thanks. Thanks a lot, Federico, for your appreciation. And I don't know, if there is not any other question, I think that we can finish our class here, but at first, we're gonna give him thanks to Federico for the class. Vamos a terminar. No hay más preguntas. Estoy agradeciendo a Federico. I'm giving thank you, Federico, for being here with this way to share with us some of the ideas that you're working and research there and all the knowledge that you got since this Latin American view, especially because it's not the same view from the American anthropologists that they got the other theoretical influences, and we got another view because we are living and we are shared with them, and it's not the same for us, the meaning that their own rights and initiatives that the people who doesn't live in with them think that they know. And it's very, very, very interesting your point of view for us, Federico. Thanks a lot. Entonces, chicas, chicos, no sé si le quieren dar las gracias a Federico, pues ya como para cerrar la clase y poder quedarnos un momentico para mirar unas cosas de las notas. Entonces, bueno, pues podemos decirle chao, Federico.
Bye.
Gracias. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Federico. We need to talk later. In another moment, we can have a meeting and discuss about a lot of things that we got in
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. Gracias pela
Okay.
invitación. Gracias.
Thanks a lot, Federico.
Thank
Have a
you.
good
Bye.
afternoon. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.